class, this is Laura Klein, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about rhetorical analysis today. So with rhetorical analysis, whatever type of text that you're looking at, whether it's a full book or an article, there are some certain ways to approach figuring out what you're going to say about the text. And a rhetorical analysis, like most papers, is thesis driven. So you have a point that you want to make about the text, and then you are trying to prove that point through providing evidence from the text and also doing some specific types of analysis to look at specific types of the text. For instance, in a literary analysis, you might be looking at themes or symbols or characters. Well, it's a little bit different what you're going to look at in a rhetorical analysis. And rhetoric is basically just moves people make in order to make a convincing argument. So you're looking at an article or a book that's trying to make an argument, prove its own thesis, and you're evaluating that thesis. Is it strong? Is it not strong? Is it reaching its intended audience? That sort of thing. So one of the first things you want to think about, because it's one of the most important things to think about when you're looking at the way that somebody's presenting an argument, is audience. And audience, you want to look at who is the audience for what you are looking at. And I drew a very artistic amphitheater here because, so if that's my little stick figure up on the stage and I'm the writer, then I have more than one audience. And we say primary audience, it's the people that would be sitting in the front row, and the secondary audience are the people back in the nosebleed seats, alright? So the primary audience is the person that you're directly writing for. So for instance, when you write an essay for class, you're writing it directly for me and some of your classmates who might read it in peer editing. A professional writer is writing for a specific audience that you can tell, well, how? Well, you can look at the publication it's published in, right? So if something's published in the New York Times, that has a different audience than a BMX magazine, or a different audience even than the Wall Street Journal. And so you're kind of looking at the demographic information for the publication, who was going to read that publication. And so the writer, if they're effectively making an argument, should be addressing those specific people that they're writing for, the audience of the magazine or publication. You can also sometimes gather who they're writing for through what they say. Audience and purpose are kind of married together, right? So purpose, what is the author trying to say? And that's another really basic thing, right, that you have to figure out when you are writing. So purpose plus audience, and they go together. They love each other, loving each other. And so as you're looking for the purpose, you're looking for what that person's thesis is. What are they trying to prove? So if we're looking at Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal, you might, what is his purpose? What is the problem that he has found in his society, and how is he trying to address that? What is he saying the solution is? What's his proposal? What is the proposal? And this is the same for any article or nonfiction book you read, right? You read something in the New York Times. Well, sometimes the purpose is just to report, and we don't usually do rhetorical analysis on that because the person is not at all trying to persuade. They're just trying to say, this is what happened this week in the Middle East. And there's no, slant on it. There's no political position. There's nothing like that. It's just reporting. Of course, it might not be. And then you can start to do some analysis if you think that there's some sort of bias in the reporting. But we call it bias when it's in reporting because you're not supposed to have it. Whereas when you are making a persuasive argument, you are intended to have some position, right? And so you find that usually in a newspaper on something like the editorial pages, sometimes in features they're making arguments. And you also find this in a lot of magazine articles, a lot of nonfiction books, almost all nonfiction books. They're trying to persuade you of something, whether it's to do something or to think a certain way or proposing a solution to a problem. These are all the kinds of essays that you write in English 101 class, for instance, or essays that are, showing a position on something. So rhetorical analysis is just looking at how well somebody else is doing that, so you're kind of grading them. So once you've determined what that purpose is, what their thesis is, what they're trying to persuade, then you can figure out whether or not that's effective. And part of that is figuring out whether or not it adequately addresses the audience. So it's not just that, it's who's listening and why. So that's important. Who's listening and why are they listening? Well, if they're listening because it's an economics magazine and they want to learn about economics and they want to figure out a solution to a problem, well, then you have to figure out, are you using the right kind of language, the right kind of tone to address that particular audience? But another important part of it is, who does the audience want, or who does the writer, want to be listening to this? And would they be? And is he doing a good job of addressing those people? So if you're writing to legislators, you're going to adopt a certain kind of tone and things like that. So you want to make sure that that's appropriate. The other thing that you're going to look at when you look at a text, so who's the audience, what's the purpose, and the last thing is, what's the context? And so this is a lovely drawing of a text. It's a little book. This is all on scratch paper, so sorry if you can see through it. And the context is everything that surrounds it, right? So history and philosophy, are there any wars going on? The author's biography, the economy, religious influences in the society, all of these social issues that are affecting the text, because texts are not created in a vacuum, right? If I were to write a book, I would be affected by all the things that had happened in my life, but also all the things that were happening in my society. Technologies that are available, things like that. And so if people are writing about a time period that's not their own, they're still affected by those things. So if I was going to write a novel about the 1940s, I would probably be affected still by the economy today and the way that I perceived our economy in comparison to the economy then. Knowing what's going to happen, knowing history, would affect the way that I perceived the past, right? So this is especially true of nonfiction pieces, because they're usually directly addressing things that are happening in society. So when we go back, if you're reading something that's written in 1996, well, what was happening in 1996 that was having a lot of influence on society, and that's what have influenced a writer? And that's not that long ago. If you're going back and looking at something written in 1865, again, you have to look at what was going on in that society. We can't look at the text out of context by bringing our points of view from what we know now to something that was written in the past. So that's something to consider as well. What was happening in the society at the time? What was the context for it? So if it's addressing a problem, what's the history of that problem? How have other people addressed that problem? For instance, with Swift, he's addressing the problem of hunger, right? And it might be important to see what he's doing, to see how other people were addressing it. How were economists of the time looking at this problem? And to know also that economics was a relatively new field at the time. So looking at it in a certain way might have been a new way to approach that problem. Okay, so once you've determined all that, you're just gathering information at this point, learning about the text itself. Then it becomes time to look at whether or not it's effective, right? And some of the ways that you're going to look at the effectiveness are by thinking about the tone. Is the tone appropriate for the audience? So if I'm writing in a magazine for skateboarders, and I'm writing an article about the best kinds of ramps, so obviously I know nothing about skateboarding, then I might use a certain tone that might not be the same tone. It might not be appropriate if I were writing an open letter to legislators about some sort of policy decision, right? So the tone has to fit the audience. The next thing is the audience, so they go together, right? The next thing is it logical? So you're looking at whether or not you think it's plausible. If it's providing a solution to a problem or suggesting that we do something or change our beliefs or something on something, is that plausible? Does it leave big holes where you're like, well, I don't really know. I don't see how that would work or how that could happen. So you're looking for whether or not it builds in a logical manner as an argument. Does it provide sufficient evidence? Are there facts? Are there statistics? And then the last thing is, does it make assumptions or large leaps in logic? So if you're making major assumptions, you're just assuming that your audience is going to go along with you without giving any convincing argument or evidence to help support your points. And that's a negative, right? That makes an argument less effective. So another important way of approaching that is through the rhetorical triangle. And the rhetorical triangle is basically, should be able to see this better. There are two overlapping triangles. So there are three important parts of the experience of a text. There's the text itself, what's written. There's the writer, and then there's the reader, right? You can write something and have a purpose, but it doesn't matter if nobody's going to read it, right? And you can have a reader and a writer, but you need to have an actual text. So they're interdependent. And then there are three rhetorical appeals, and those appeals are pathos, ethos, and logos. And logos means logic, and the logical appeal appeals to somebody's logic. And you do that through using facts and statistics and convincing argument. And that is associated with the text itself. So the text itself should be logical. Pathos is an emotional appeal, or the pathetic appeal, as it's sometimes called. And that's an appeal, we see this a lot in advertising, right? Appealing to people's emotions to get them to do something or adopt a certain belief. And that's associated with the reader because pathos affects the reader. So the reader is affected by the logic or by the emotionality of the argument. So if the argument is really trying to make you feel sorry for the subjects of the argument, that sort of thing, that's an emotional appeal, a pathetic appeal. Pathos. And the last part is ethos, and that's associated with the writer, and ethos is the ethical appeal. So ethos appeals to people's sense of ethics, of responsibility, and also to the credibility of the writer. So that's why it's associated with the writer, is because it's about establishing credibility. So if I'm reading an article in a magazine and I don't know who the author is, and it's just some guy from off the street, and it might not be as credible, and then it might have a bad tone, it might be ranting, that sort of thing. So that's an ineffective argument. If the writer takes the time to establish his credibility, show his or her knowledge in the subject area that he or she is writing in, that's an appeal to ethos. So there's all these different ways that you're going to look at and approach the text, and then what do you do with it? Well, now you have to write an essay about an essay. So in the end, you put it all together, and then you have a thesis about the effectiveness of the text. So your thesis would say, in so-and-so's article in the New York Times on the Middle East, I believe that the argument is effective because he or she does this, okay? But then you take the I believe out, because that's what you do with a thesis. So a thesis begins with what you believe about the text. Do you believe it's effective and why? And then you take the I believe out of it so that you can present your own argument. This text is effective because, and that's the format of your thesis at its most basic. And then you use all of this analysis of these other parts of the text, the tone, the audience, the purpose, how they all fit together, the context, to show why, or why it's effective or why it's not effective, and to support each of your points in the body paragraphs of your essay. So hopefully that explains a little bit about rhetorical analysis. If you have any questions, remember, feel free to email me.